On today's show, a second half to forget in San Antonio. The Hawks build a 24-point lead and then give it all away in the second half against the lowly Spurs. A calamitous defeat, and we'll get into all of what transpired and more coming up.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1434 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Sunday evening into Monday to begin a new week. And today's podcast is brought to you by PrizePicks. If you're a first-time user, get a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. That is PrizePicks.com, promo code LOCKEDON. I also want to tell you at the top of the podcast and encourage you to make us your first listen each and every day here at Locked On Hawks. Find us anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and anywhere across the board. And today's show is going to be breaking down a maddening result for the Atlanta Hawks, a 126-118 loss in San Antonio. And if that's all I told you, it would already be pretty bad because the Hawks were, spoiler alert, 10-point favorites in this game, according to our friends at FanDuel. The Spurs are one of the worst teams in the league. So no matter what the context is, losing to the Spurs by 8 points is not good. Especially when it was Dejounte Murray return to San Antonio for the first time in a Hawks uniform. The Hawks had a chance to get above 500 with a win in this game. And now I'll get into the nitty-gritty because the Hawks were up by 24 points with 23 minutes to go on Sunday afternoon, again, against a bad team. Yes, it was on the road, but certainly in total control. And we have to start here. And honestly, I would encourage you to use any word that you think is appropriate for the second half. It could be described as a collapse or a calamity or a disaster or a catastrophe or a meltdown or all kinds of words, but you could choose your favorite. I'll say this now as a broad description. It was the worst half of the season in my mind for the Hawks. Second half today against the Spurs was the worst half of the season for Atlanta. And that's not said lightly. The Hawks had some pretty bad halves. I can think of a few back a long ways ago. Like there was a bad half in Toronto. There was a bad half against Charlotte in October. There's been bad halves along the way for a team that is, by the way, now below 500 again through 71 games. But I've seen every minute of the season, and this was as bad or worse than any half of the year. They lost to the Spurs in the second half by a 65-35 margin. They lost a half to the Spurs, who are now, with this win, 19-52 by 30 points in 24 minutes. From another angle, the Hawks set a new season high for scoring with 83 points in the first half of this game, and they managed to lose it on the floor by 8 as a 10-point favorite. So I will definitely save some of the unpacking for later on, but we have to talk about the second half numbers and kind of the broad strokes, the bullets at the top of the podcast before we get into anything else. Because by my count, the Hawks scored 35 points, which is definitely true, on 47 possessions in the second half offensively. That is about a 74 or 75 offensive rating for a full game or 400 possessions. That is horrendous. That is way worse than the worst offense in the league would possibly be. They scored fewer points in the second half today than they did in either first or second quarters earlier in the same game. They shot 33% from the floor in the game. They were, in the second half, they were 0 of 10 from 3 in the second half. They missed 3 free throws. They were 3 of 6 at the line. They had 4 assists and 7 turnovers after halftime. And the centers were 6 of 9 from the floor, which is very solid. Capella and Okongwu. Everyone else was 10 of 39 from the field, which is about 25% from the floor. Quinn Snyder after the game acknowledged that they were 0 of 10 from 3, and that's, some of that's just going to happen. I'm a big fan of pointing out where there'll be some nights or quarters or halves where the shooting variance goes against you. But Snyder did say correctly that it was, quote, not just about that, end quote, and that there are things that the Hawks could have done better and had control over that they just did not execute on, which is certainly the case. One of those things was shot selection. And even in the first half, this is me talking now, the Hawks took some shots that were probably not the best shots, and they ended up making them in the first half, missing them in the second half. But the Hawks settled a lot in this game. And really, they settled too much, especially in the second half, and just the process was quite bad after halftime. And the Spurs, I talked about how bad they are earlier in this discussion, but San Antonio quite literally has the worst defensive rating in the NBA and pretty much the worst defensive rating in the history of the modern NBA. Now, this is a very fast offensive environment, but no matter what, the Spurs were terrible defensively, and they were shorthanded as well. The Hawks were a healthier team in this game. It started with a terrible start for the third quarter. I'll say that. That should not be ignored. A lot of the focus, including by me after the game on Twitter and other places, was about how bad the fourth quarter was, and that's certainly the case. But the beginning of the third quarter was also bad. they let the Spurs back into the game. They gave them some confidence because the lead got down to like 15 pretty quickly. And if you're able to kind of hold that lead in that 20-point range, it's just that mental thing where the opponent kind of knows they're probably cooked at that point. But the Hawks came out of the gate and just took a bunch of bad shots early in the third quarter. And the Hawks, a good team, I'll say this, a good team would have put the game away in the third quarter. And the Hawks did the exact opposite of that. Then, of course, the centerpiece of the collapse was the fourth quarter, where the Hawks had a 16-0 run given to them by the Spurs, in which the Hawks did not score on 11 consecutive possessions. It is hard to do that in the NBA, especially when you are, by all accounts, a good offensive team like the Hawks are. But to go 0 for 11 on possessions, they also had a couple of those trips had more than one shot. They still didn't score. They didn't score for almost 6 full minutes. And again, the Spurs are terrible defensively. So the Hawks just couldn't score. It was a process failure. It was an execution failure. It was a failure of staying calm and under control because the Hawks clearly, in my mind, got flummoxed and started to press and got frustrated. And I guess with good reason, but still that kind of overwhelmed them late. The game was not over, and they kind of just packed it in on some level. It was an emotional failure. It was all those things. It was just a total calamity in the first half, starting the second half. And the crazy thing is the defense was actually fine in the fourth quarter. That was probably the only quarter of the game went fine. But as soon as the Hawks started to get some stops on defense, they completely stopped scoring. It was honestly unbelievable. I waited a little bit longer than usual to record this podcast because, number one, it was an early afternoon game. But also, number two, I wanted to watch the second half even more intently than I always do before I actually record these podcasts. And it was just baffling, the process, really. And yes, the Hawks missed a bunch of shots that they sometimes make, but that is not the only reason why they could not score in the second half. They took a bunch of terrible shots and then a bunch of bad turnovers, and just it was maddening. They didn't run. There was no urgency, none of that stuff. And I'll come back to it later on in the podcast. But that is the broad strokes of this one. I usually go into all of the offensive defensive numbers at this point in time, but I'm just going to let it simmer right now, and talk about the first half being better. Yes, obviously. The second half was such a calamity. The Hawks were, again, 10-point favorites in this game. And since October, the Hawks have been favored by 10 points or more only twice. They were both against San Antonio. They beat them handily the first time. They lost to them this time. And, just a bizarre, memorable in a bad way kind of night. Hopefully a night to forget if you're on the Hawks roster, if you're a coach or whatever. But for fans, I saw probably a new level of frustration after the game, and I totally understand. It's one of those days when I won't even tell you. If you're a new listener to the podcast, first of all, welcome aboard. Second of all, my brand would be to come out and tell you on this podcast that the Hawks played badly, but it's only one game out of 82. That is definitely true, but I don't blame anybody for getting mad about this one. This is a complete disaster after halftime. There's no explaining it away. Yes, it's a one-game sample size. Who cares? On this night, I will certainly just endorse all of the takes this time around. We'll get into the nuance as we always do on the podcast in a second. But headlining to bring things full circle one more time, the worst half of the season for Atlanta happened second half, March 19th, in a game where they should have won comfortably and ended up losing relatively comfortably at the end in San Antonio. All right, we'll get into how it all unfolded, for better or for worse, mostly for worse, in a second. But first, a word from our sponsors on the podcast today. Today's show is brought to you by PrizePicks. If you're looking for your daily fantasy option this time of year, check out the award-winning app at PrizePicks. PrizePicks Daily Fantasy made easy. It's amazing. I know that you will love it as well. It's very easy to use. I've been playing there for a couple of years now. It's really a breeze to operate over at PrizePicks. All you have to do is pick 2 to 6 players, actually choose will have more or less than a certain number of points or rebounds or assists or steals, etc. At PrizePicks, won 25 times. Yes, 25 times on the money on your entries. And they have numbers across the sports world. That includes the NBA, of course, and college basketball, NFL, college football, MLB, NHL, PGA, soccer, esports, and more. And the whole entry can be done in just a minute or less. It's that easy and it's that quick. Plus, it's just you against the numbers. They have safe and fast withdrawals at PrizePicks, and you can sign up right now across the board, really in 30 states, actually more than 30 states, plus Canada. That includes Georgia as well. Download the app right now at PrizePicks or go to PrizePicks.com to sign up and play down fantasy sports immediately. And if you're a first-time user, get a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code LOCKEDON. Don't forget to enter that promo code LOCKEDON at sign up for the instant deposit match up to $100. Check it out now at PrizePicks. All right, and we'll get into how this game kind of transpired. And early on, it was aggressive, but also very offense heavy. It was some kind of on-brand matinee afternoon basketball where teams were not dialed in defensively from the outset. Dejounte Murray in his first game back in San Antonio was predictably aggressive early on. He took 4 shots in 2.5 minutes, took 7 shots in the first quarter, ended up with 25 shot attempts, and he did not play very well, I didn't think, in this game, despite leading the Hawks in scoring and assists. That's one of those games where you probably need to watch it closely to realize he was not very good in his return to San Antonio. But the Hawks were dominating the glass. Trey had kind of a funny start, but the Hawks were up by only one midway through the first quarter because they just could not get stops. It seemed like the Hawks were emphasizing stopping the ball from getting into the middle of the defense. After that had been an issue in recent days, but they were giving up lanes from the wings instead. Rotationally, it was kind of the same story as it's been for a while now. 9 guys played. It was AJ Griffin in place of Jalen Johnson, and AJ was one of the bright spots in this game. Bogey had a good start to this one as well. He made 2 of his first 3 threes, plus a catch and shoot long 2 with a foot on the line. But the Hawks were up by 6 early on. They scored 40 points in the first quarter. They did anything they wanted to do in the first quarter offensively. 40 points, 9 assists, 1 turnover, 5 offensive rebounds. They were just fantastic. Defensively, though, they were pretty bad at the outset. The Spurs got what they wanted to sort of in and around the rim. And the only reason why the Hawks were even winning at the end of the first quarter was because they had the huge rebounding advantage that they had really the entire game. In the second quarter, AJ Griffin had, again, as I said before, a really nice game here, but he had a nice up and under move for a bucket, also had a second chance bucket after his own miss to force a timeout from the Spurs. Defensively, he had a couple of block shots in a row. He was very good in this one. I thought Okongwu also played well in the first half. One of the brighter spots there as well. The Hawks were up by 10 mid-second quarter, largely on the strength of the glass, as I said before, but the Hawks average about 14 second chance points per game. So offensive rebounds, putbacks, etc. They had more than that in the first 15 minutes of the game. So they were really punishing San Antonio on the glass in this one. The Hawks broke it open with a 10-0 run mid-second quarter to go up by 17, and I will certainly admit this. When that run happened, I thought the game was over, or at least mostly. Obviously, it's never over that early in the game, but because the Spurs are so bad, the Hawks were in total control. They had 10 points on 4 possessions. They stuck with AJ longer than usual because he was so good. In fact, it was one of the best halves of AJ's career to this point. 15 points and 6 rebounds in a half for AJ. Plus, defensively, he was pretty good. So that was nice to see. And defensively, they were better in that quarter as well. I thought Capella was much more engaged and good defensively in the second quarter. And the Hawks kept pulling away. It was a good challenge late by Quinn Snyder to overturn a 3-point play opportunity. And the Hawks go into the halftime break up 21 points. They scored a season-high 83 points on 52 possessions in the first half. Almost a 160 offensive rating. So I would always be the first to tell you, like, that's not sustainable for anybody against, not even against the Spurs. So it was going to cool off on some level, but it went drastically the other way. But the Hawks really had just these crazy numbers in the first half. They shot 6% from the floor. They had 18 second chance points, 14 and 14 at the line, 17 assists, 5 turnovers. They had 7 guys with at least 8 points in the first half. It was wild. Anyway, second half, obviously not great. We talked about the numbers earlier, but it really started again with the beginning of the third quarter. So the Hawks missed 5 straight shots after making their first bucket of the quarter, and then had a turnover. Process-wise, it was pretty passive. They were settling. It was a 10-0 run by the Spurs to get back into the game in a hurry. Then it was down to 10 by the middle of the quarter. Trey got a technical foul. By the way, that's his 14th of the season. Trey only can get 1 more technical foul for the rest of the year before a suspension would happen, a la what happened with Draymond Green on Friday, who missed the game against the Hawks. Trey is in danger of getting a suspension if he gets 2 more technicals this year. Devin Vassell, who's a local product from Gwinnett County around the Atlanta area, had 14 points in like a 6-minute stretch in the third quarter. That got the Spurs going a little bit, which Snyder sort of tipped his cap to Vassell, who made some tough shots, admittedly, during that run. And then the Spurs had their second big run late in the third quarter, a 9-0 run. San Antonio hit 7 threes in the first 9 minutes of the second half. So if you were trying to construct a narrative, and I would not do this, but if you were trying to, that said, look, the Spurs played great in the second half, you would point to this. San Antonio scored 34 points in the first 9 minutes of the second half, and they hit 7 threes. Now, that is not sustainable, even with the Hawks playing poorly defensively, and they were. I want to be very clear about this. The Hawks were playing very poorly defensively in the third quarter. The Spurs were very hot, and it takes 2 teams in the NBA to close a deficit that's this large, but the Spurs did play well, and the Hawks were also very bad. Trey had a floater at the end of the quarter to go back up by 3 points, but it was very bad. Offensively, they scored 20 points on 25 shots, 25 possessions, I should say. That's one of the worst marks imaginable, and it actually got worse in the second and the fourth quarter. The Hawks were 2 of 13 on shots outside of 8 feet in the third quarter. But my issue in the third quarter was this. The Hawks took 9 long twos in the third quarter. That is way too many for any quarter, especially when you're trying to preserve a lead. Just some bad process, lots of like lazy 18-foot pull-ups from Murray and Hunter, etc. And defensively, they got torched. So we know what happens next, the fourth quarter. So a couple big shots early from Murray in the fourth quarter to keep the lead briefly. And then the defense did pick it up. They had, I believe, 6 straight stops in the middle of the fourth quarter from the defense. It was better, but the offense genuinely was horrifying. I told you earlier, the Hawks went 11 straight possessions without scoring. This is the short version, but I'm going to give you the Cliff's notes of those 11 possessions in a row. It was, and I quote, Hunter misses a 3. Collins misses a 3. Capella commits an offensive foul. Collins misses a 3. Hunter misses a 2. Trey misses a 3. Trey turns it over. Murray misses a 3. Trey misses a floater. Capella misses a tip-in. Murray misses a jumper. Hunter gets blocked. Murray gets blocked. And then Trey turns it over. So that's actually more than 11 quote-unquote possessions because a couple of those were, again, second chances. So the Hawks actually have like 13 shooting possessions in 11 possessions, and they just simply could not get anything to fall. Plus, they had some process stuff with the offensive fouls, and Trey having 2 turnovers. So they didn't score for almost 6 full minutes. And at that point, the Hawks had 31 points in 22 and a half minutes. That is unbelievable. That's almost a full half with 31 points against, again, the worst defense in the league in the Spurs. And that coincided with the Spurs scoring 16 points in a row to go from down 8 to up 8. And at that point, it was not over, but the Hawks were basically cooked. Down 8 with like 2 minutes to go. Finally, out of the timeout, Capella gets the layup to stop the bleeding, and then Collins draws a charge. So they're within 6 again, and like actually back into the game. But then after that, I think the moment that it was probably over was Murray missing a 3 that would have been a huge shot. The Spurs scored, and then Trey gets fouled and misses both free throws. It was probably already over, but when Trey misses free throws at the end of the game, down 8, you know that's going to be the end of the contest. So plenty to get to about like how it all happened, but we'll save the offensive numbers for a second, defensive numbers for a second, and as well, we'll get into our trademark individual observations where there were some good for sure. There was also some very bad, and we'll get into that in a second. But first, a word from our sponsors on the show today. Today's show is brought to you by Nissan, and Nissan's Most Electric Player of the Week is brought to you by the all-new, all-electric 2023 Nissan Aria. And this week's choice is going to be Bogdan Bogdanovic. The Nissan Aria, by the way, is brilliantly fiercely elegant, and also styling and powerful, bringing an impressive combination of traits to the table. It's the perfect crossover. And Bogey is not their best player on the Hawks roster, nor was he the best player this week, but he did sign a new contract and was a huge talking point over the last few days. And he's also making a lot of shots in recent days. 50% from three-point range. Yes, 50% three-point range. It's the All-Star break, and that includes today's game where he went 2 for 4 on Sunday, and there's plenty to monitor about his future as well. The Nissan Aria packs power that will pin you to your seat. It also has premium intelligence, all-in-one EV, the all-new, all-electric 2023 Nissan Aria, the EV for people who love to drive. Shop now at nissanusa.com. Today's show is brought to you by Built Bar, and the Built March Madness bracket is here. I'm sure you have a favorite, either Built Bar or Built Pluff flavor right now, and really now is the time. Make that opinion note and make it count in the Built March Madness festivities. Good fact, go to BuiltMarchMadness.com to vote for your favorites. You've been listening to the show for a while. You probably know this already, but I am a fan of cookies and cream. It's my number one flavor at Built Bars. But if you want to support that, that's an option for you. Or if you have your own choice, of course, voting for that choice is the way to go. And also, when you vote for your favorite bar or puff, you'll be entered into a drawing where 50 Locked On listeners will get a free box of Built Bars. Not only that, but one fan will get a 12-month subscription of Built Bars to have them sent directly to your door. If you haven't tried Built Bar yet, it's time to stop waiting and go ahead and do that. They taste so good that you won't even believe they're actually good for you as well. Every bar is high protein and low in sugar, and they have 100% real chocolate on the outside. Go to BuiltMarchMadness.com right now to vote for your favorite bar or puff. Pick up a box while you're there. Vote every single day in March. So hop in now and support your pick at BuiltMarchMadness.com. Okay, and before we dive into the player evaluations, I'll give you the broad strokes numbers here. The offensive numbers look fine for the full game. If you didn't watch, you might be kind of puzzled by how bad the offense was in the fourth quarter and the second half, really in general. Because for the whole game, they had like a 118 offensive rating. That's actually pretty solid. They dominated the glass in this game, 26 extra chance points, took care of the ball at a very, very high level, but just missed a lot of threes along the way. 21 assists is pretty bad, especially after 9 in the first quarter. It was rough. And then defensively, a 125 defensive rating. The Spurs did shoot 14 of 28 from 3. And that is, again, a hot tip to them. But the rest of it was really rough from Atlanta. They did a good job on the glass, I'll say that, but didn't force turnovers. San Antonio got hot when it mattered, and the Hawks gave them a lot of, I would say, courage by their poor defense at times in this one. So I can go all day about how rough the numbers were, but the second half numbers I led the show with still apply, and it was pretty rough, even if the offense for the full game was still pretty solid because the offense was so good in the first half. All right, to the players. 9 guys appeared for Atlanta in this game. They all played at least 20 minutes. We'll start at the bottom. I thought Saddiq Bey was their worst player in this game. 20 minutes for Bey. Had 1 point, 2 rebounds, an assist and a steal. Bay only taking 2 shots 20 minutes is pretty rough for him because he kind of has to be a threat as a shooter. And then defensively, he was quite bad in this one. By the way, he was not alone. We'll get into all kinds of guys who struggled in this game, but I thought he was probably the worst offender for Atlanta because he didn't really give you much on offense either. He'll have better nights for sure, but he was very rough in this game. Bogey was okay. 13 points on 8 shots, 2 of 4 from 3 at free throw line, had 2 rebounds and an assist. Bogey shooting the ball great at this point in time, making half of his threes since the All-Star break. Defensively, it's still rough, but offensively, he was pretty solid in this game, very helpful at times, especially in the first half. And then I thought the 2 guys who really performed the best, according to their baselines, especially in this game, were Okongwu and Griffin. So we'll do Onyeka first. He had 17 points, 7 rebounds, and 20 minutes off the bench. Only took 8 shots, 5-5 at the free throw line. He was really active defensively, had a block and a steal. He's been playing very well recently. It's still a great thing the Hawks have these 2 centers who have very different skill sets, but Okongwu just gives them a different look. He was excellent in this game. I have no real negatives about Onyeka. I thought he played very well. AJ Griffin was excellent as well. I thought he had the best half of his career in the first half of this game. 15 points, and I believe all 15 of them were in the first half. 2 blocks, 7 rebounds, 6 of 10 from the floor. I will say in the second half, he wasn't particularly good, but nobody was. So I don't really bother him on that one. And he was, by the way, he was plus 21 in a game the Hawks lost by 8, which basically means he was off the floor for all of San Antonio's big runs and on the floor for Atlanta's big run in the second quarter. So there you go. AJ was awesome. Good to see him playing with confidence and playing with a lot of juice that he played with in the first half of this game. To the starters, DeAndre Hunter was the guy who probably threatened Saddiq Bey as far as being the worst in this game. Hunter was bad. He did have 12 points, but on 13 shooting possessions, 5-12 from the floor, 0-3 from 3. Did have 5 rebounds, but only 2 defensive rebounds, 2 assists, 2 turnovers, minus 19. Defensively, he was really rough by his standards. Offensively, just was one of the offenders of taking a bunch of bad shots. I thought he was very bad in this game. Probably the better, I would say worse than the numbers indicate as far as watching versus comparing to the performance of the box score. Other offenders, Trey was not good. 9 points, did have 6 assists, 5 turnovers, 4 rebounds. Trey was 4-15 from the floor, 1 of 4 from 3. It was beyond a bad shooting night. It was a bad decision-making night for Trey, especially in the second half. I don't think he played that badly in the first half, despite some modest numbers by his standards. And they did, it seemed like, make a concerted effort to play more through Dejounte. I don't know if that was because they were back in San Antonio or what, but it was probably a lower usage game for Trey on the whole. Didn't play a ton of minutes in this game either. Just didn't play well. And I will say it's important to note that he was on the injury report coming in as questionable with a knee contusion. So maybe a little bit hobbled in this game. That's probably part of the calculus with Trey playing less and also not playing all that well, but he was not very good in this one. I thought Collins was fine. 14.6 rebounds. He was certainly in the upper half of guys who played at least reasonably well in this game. Not as good as Okongwu and Griffin compared to their baselines, but still played fairly well. Defensively, he was fine. Offensively, he was 5 of 8 on 2s, 1 of 4 on 3s. Did his job for the most part. No turnovers, just was okay. Didn't have a great game nor a bad game. Capella, I thought, was pretty solid, especially after the first quarter. He had kind of a rough start in the first, then really found it after that. 15 points, 12 rebounds, a block, and a steal in 28 minutes. He was efficient around the rim. Both centers were really, argue, 2 of their best 3 players in this game. So no real huge notes on Capella. And then Dejounte. I thought Dejounte was pretty bad, honestly. I think the Hawks probably wanted him in a perfect world to have this great game coming back to San Antonio. He took a lot of shots. In fact, he took 10 more shots than anyone on the roster, including Trey. He was 10 of 25 from the floor, 0 of 3 from 3. That's not the worst efficiency in the world, but 22 points on 26 shots is going to get you beat a lot of the time. Did have 8 assists and no turnovers. That's obviously good. But 6 rebounds, fine. 4 fouls, minus 13. I think defensively, he's been really bad for a while. I'm kind of flummoxed on how to talk about it because I keep saying kind of the similar things about Murray's defense. It's been disappointing all year long. His on-ball stuff is really rough. Playmaking-wise, obviously he does help you there, but it's been stark. I think people are starting to notice more and more now as they watch him that it's not been good defensively all year long. So I want to pile on Dejounte, and obviously a big game for him. I'm sure it was very emotional going back to San Antonio where he played his entire career until this year, but I thought he struggled pretty badly, especially in the second half. So, okay, we'll leave it there on this game. I think I've got my point across. This is a pretty bad performance from the Hawks. I don't have much to add on that. It is one of 82, but given this was game 71 and they had a terrible half like that. And look, I've started to see kind of more reactions and responses and emails and tweets and DMs kind of asking, should the Hawks maybe try to miss the playoffs? They're not going to try to miss the playoffs. I'll say that now. The Hawks are going to try all the way through. They've come too far. They have a star in place in Trey that's not going to want to do that. They have a coach in Quinn that's not going to want to do that. I understand the question because the Hawks have been that kind of maddening this year. They have been outscored for the season. They have a negative point differential. They have a negative record now, one below 500. Even if they were to win every game the rest of the season, they'd be 46-36, which is below their projection for the year. So, and by the way, that's not going to happen. So, anyway, pretty maddening stuff. And I'll say this about the standings because I'm sure people are still tracking that, and they should be. If the Hawks wake up on Monday morning in the wrong side of things with Toronto playing in Milwaukee tonight on Sunday, I'm recording this podcast a little earlier than usual, so I don't have the result just yet. But if Toronto, who has been good lately, goes on the road and beats Milwaukee, the Hawks will be, for the first time in a while, the 9th seed in the East. Now, that's obviously still in the play-in. And look, the Hawks are 3 games clear of the Pacers and Wizards as I record this podcast on Sunday evening to at least make the play-in. It would be pretty surprising to me if the Hawks missed the play-in because they probably have to go realistically something like 4-7 or worse to have a real chance of missing the play-in. But that's not impossible. And I think, moreover, being out of the top 8 is bad news because then you have to win twice in the play-in, which is not where you want to be. So, I think Toronto is obviously the underdog in Milwaukee as I record this podcast on the evening. So they're probably not definitely, but probably will lose. But even then, the Hawks will have only a half game lead on the Raptors. And that's not great, especially when they're now 2.5 behind the Heat, might be 3 behind the Heat by the time you're listening to this podcast on Monday. From here, the Hawks also play a back-to-back on Tuesday and Wednesday. This would be only a small consolation now because of today's game in particular, but the Hawks do have arguably the easiest matchup on the NBA schedule on Tuesday. They play a home game on normal rest against Detroit. And Detroit, all due respect to Detroit, has been very bad for a long time now. They have the worst record in the East. I believe the worst record in the NBA. Yes, it's and the worst record in the NBA. And while early in the year they had some mojo a little bit, they've shut a lot of guys down. They have a lot of injuries. Bojan Bogdanovic is out. Alec Burks is out. Isaiah Stewart's been out. Kate Cunningham's been obviously out for a long time now. So the Pistons in their current form are probably the league's worst team, and they're coming to Atlanta on Tuesday. So if the Hawks lose that one, I don't even know what to say, but we'll hold that for then, obviously. But after that, it's obviously a pretty tough matchup on Wednesday. They go to Minnesota on the back-to-back. So I think the projection there has to be 1-1, maybe more likely to go 2-0 than 0-2, but nothing is assured there. And if every time they go 1-1 over a stretch, that's not going to improve your standing much in the East at this point in time. So buckle up for Tuesday's game. I know that even as I say how easy the matchup is, people are going to point to the Hawks just losing today. And I don't blame you because the Hawks had a very easy matchup in this game. In fact, it doesn't get much easier than being up 24 points in the second half in San Antonio. But they got away from them. Hopefully they get to reset things as they fly back on Sunday evening and get prepared for the Tuesday night home game against the Pistons. That's it for me on today's podcast. I'm sure there'll be more ranting and raving than usual from me on this one, but it was obviously just a maddening display from Atlanta. I do encourage you, though, to jump aboard the podcast. If you're a new listener, thank you for listening to the podcast this all the way through, and I definitely encourage you to subscribe across podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, also Stitcher. We're on YouTube on the video side, likes and subscriptions. I also have a written service. It's patreon.com/BT Rowland for my Hawks musings there. Follow the show on Twitter at Locked On Hawks. Follow me on Twitter at BT Rowland. Thank you sincerely for listening to the podcast, especially making it all the way to this episode because it was definitely a pretty maddening end to the weekend. And we'll have more content coming to you in the very near future. I'm not sure exactly when. At the very latest, though, it'll be after the game on Tuesday. So stay tuned, buckle up, follow me across the platforms, follow the show, and we'll see you all next time.